Hi, y'all. I'm Atticus, a bookseller at Literati Bookstore and the host for tonight's event. This evening, we are pleased to welcome Jonathan Reisman to our At Home with Literati series in support of The Unseen Body, a doctor's journey through the hidden wonders of the human body. For our attendees, the chat is closed, but I will be dropping the link to purchase The Unseen Body from Literati throughout the event. You can also use the Q&A feature on your toolbar to submit questions at any time. I'll ask a selection of them at the conclusion of the event, and if there aren't any, I'll have some myself, or we'll just let Dr. Reisman go for it. A reminder that you can shop for more books in store at Literati Bookstore or at literatibookstore.com for curbside pickup, as well as shipping to your home anywhere in the United States. And now allow me to introduce tonight's author. Dr. Jonathan Reisman is a doctor of internal medicine and pediatrics, as well as a naturalist, adventure traveler, and teacher of wilderness survival and prehistoric crafts, and his offbeat writing combines all of these passions. He has practiced medicine in some of the world's most remote places, in the Russian and Alaskan Arctic, Antarctica, the Nepali Himalayas, rural Appalachia, the urban slums of Kolkata, India, and among the Olga Sioux in South Dakota. His writing has appeared in the New York Times, Slate, and the Washington Post. He runs a nonprofit to improve healthcare and education in India, and he lives in Philadelphia with his wife and children. Without further ado, I will turn it over to Jonathan.
Thank you so much, Atticus, and thanks to Literati for having me tonight. I'm Dr. Jonathan Reisman. As Atticus mentioned, I'm a physician trained in both internal medicine and pediatrics, but I mostly work in the emergency room. I'm also a writer, and I'm here to talk about my very first book, The Unseen Body. The book is based on my exploration of the human body through my years as a medical student, through residency, my medical training, in the medical career that I'm currently still in. And also it includes my interests, as Atticus mentioned, in travel, the natural world, food, and even prehistoric crafts. So now, before I went to medical school, I, like most other people, like probably most of you, if you're not in the healthcare field, I found the inside of my body pretty much a mystery. You know, like other people, I lived my everyday life on the body's surface, which is how most of us live it. It's mostly about how we interact with others in the world surrounding us, how we interact with other humans, with the natural world, and those around us, while the inside pretty much remains an enigma. We never see it. Our insides pretty much never show themselves, thankfully. They never see the light. They remain in pitch black, only to be shown the light in operating rooms or after terrible penetrating traumas. And most people don't really think much about their insides until some symptom or some pain grabs their attention and forces them to think about it and often worry about what's going on in there. But then in my medical training, I really went from knowing pretty much nothing to learning more than I ever imagined about all the body parts and all the body fluids that make us tick, that keep us alive and healthy. And it went way beyond just the usual well-known organs, the heart, the lungs, and the liver. One thing I found was that body parts have stories. And through my medical education and career, I've learned a lot of those stories. You know, you meet liver after liver, heart after heart, hundreds and hundreds over the decades of your medical practice. You really get to know all these different body parts in very intimate ways. And that's something that I've always found fascinating from my first day of medical school onward. And this book, The Unseen Body, is my attempt to share that fascination with people, fascination about how the body works, but also some of the deeper aspects to the body, what they tell us about ourselves, about each other, and how we relate to the universe around us, how the inside of our body relates to the outside, etc. So when I learned about the body, I learned about it broken down into parts. That's how medical textbooks are organized, by chapter. And so my book is also organized in that same way, where each chapter is about a different body part or bodily fluid, and even some unexpected body parts like that you haven't thought much about: the pineal gland deep in your brain, the fat on your body, fingers and toes, and even the throat. Not just body parts, but bodily fluids as well. And basically my talk tonight is going to be structured in the same way. So I've chosen 3 chapters, 3 body parts and bodily fluids that we're going to discuss. I'm going to read from those chapters, and I'm going to intersperse some readings throughout what I have to say. So taking you back to my very first day of medical school, basically I was tossed right into the deep end of what it means to work in healthcare. And by that, I mean, I was led into the anatomy lab, I was handed a scalpel, and I was instructed to start dissecting my cadaver. There was no sugarcoating, there was no getting to know the grosser aspects and the more, repulsive aspects of life, including its end. It was just, here's a dead body, now go. And the anatomy lab was this large fluorescent lit room, and it smelled very strongly of formaldehyde. There were gurneys scattered around it, and each with a nameless human body laying face down on the top. So basically, on day one, we were introduced to the gruesome truths of life, including, as I said, its end. And then years later, when I started actually working in a hospital, I got the same abrupt introduction to some things that tend to be rather gross about the human body, the more repulsive sights and smells of direct patient care. That included getting my hands dirty. Not literally, I was wearing gloves most of the time, though. You do get urinated on now and then. It happened recently. A 1-year-old peed on me. It's fine. It's part of the job. But these gross things are part of the everyday truth of working in healthcare. They're also part of the everyday truth of the human body, as you all know, that we don't really discuss these things that often in public. So in my book, I want to plunge you guys right in, all my readers, I wanted to plunge them right into these gruesome truths, these gross aspects of the human body. So I really spare no details in the book. There's chapters on urine, mucus, feces. I discuss everything from the bathroom to the bedroom, and I don't sugarcoat it. And I truly believe that if you want to truly get to know the human body, then there's really no way around it. You have to be intimately familiar with these gory and supposedly gross aspects of these vessels in which we live. So on that note, let's dive right in and let's begin with urine. There's no one squeamish here tonight, right? Nah, none of you are squeamish. So let's get started. Now, I'm willing to bet that nobody has ever asked any of you before, what is your favorite bodily fluid? And most people don't have a favorite bodily fluid. They're just all repulsive and to be discarded. And to be honest, most doctors agree. In fact, there's a saying that I heard many times in medical school that doctors choose their specialty based on which bodily fluid they find the least revolting. So a doctor who finds sputum, that is mucus secreted by the lungs, gross, they should not become a pulmonologist, a lung specialist. And if blood grosses someone out, maybe makes them faint, they should not become a hematologist, a blood specialist. And the same goes for pus. If it grosses you out, don't go into infectious disease. And if snot grosses you out, don't become an ear, nose, and throat surgeon. Or in the case of my really good friend from medical school, he couldn't stand any of them. And so he became a psychiatrist. Fine, whatever floats your boat. Now, I came at bodily fluids and the body in general from the opposite direction. As a medical student, I found that each bodily fluid was fascinating in its own unique way. I realized that from the perspective of a doctor, basically each bodily fluid flowing within or from my patient's bodies outward was a language. It was a language spoken by their bodies, and it was telling me, the physician, what the medical problem is. And so making a diagnosis often meant learning the language of those bodily fluids. So I had to learn to read the messages. I had to learn to interpret various aspects of these bodily fluids, colors, consistencies, the amount of the bodily fluids, and sometimes even their smell. It's true. You use all your senses in medicine. And as I write in the urine chapter, being a medical specialist means becoming fluent in one specific fluid's dialect. Now, I'm a generalist. I work in the ER. That means I diagnose and treat conditions of virtually every body part, really whatever comes into the ER, and which is basically everything. So you could say I speak all of these languages as a beginner. I know enough of each to get by without being completely fluent, like a specialist, which is why I consult them to help me sometimes. And in other words, if I were traveling in a foreign country and had a rudimentary understanding of that language, I might be able to tell a taxi driver where to take me, or I might be able to order food, but I really don't know enough of the language to discuss politics or philosophy. That's a whole nother level of language, the level of a subspecialist. I'm a generalist. But even though I'm a generalist, I think that urine is the most fascinating bodily fluid of them all. Now, as you might know, urine is a waste product. It's made by our kidneys. Most of us are born with 2 of those kidneys, which is nice, a little redundancy, not common among internal organs. The kidneys receive blood through the arteries and they extract all the waste, all the excesses. They take it out of the bloodstream, they package it in urine and send urine careening down the ureters to the bladder and then through the urethra and then out of the body in the form of urine. And most people have, produced a sample of urine, perhaps for their doctor, perhaps for a drug test. You've peed in the little plastic cup. And I remember when I first saw a nephrologist, which is a urine specialist, take a cup of urine that you might see in any doctor's office and turn it into a diagnosis. He used a dipstick, which he stuck into the urine, which told us a bunch about what was going on in it that we could not see with our eyes. He centrifuged it, put it in a centrifuge, and we were able to look at it under the microscope. And the way he turned it into a diagnosis really struck me. So I'm going to read from the book. He was able to see inside that patient with a clairvoyance that seemed positively sorcerous, with urine as the crystal ball. From that moment, I was determined to learn urine's secret language. In the months that followed, I practiced wielding the dipstick and centrifuge and trained my eyes to recognize clues under the microscope. I befriended technicians in the hospital lab and had them save interesting urine specimens that might broaden my experience of disease. A designated cup with my name on it soon appeared in the laboratory fridge, and each day I stopped by during lunch to examine their latest finds. So all those things I saw under the microscope, you can see white blood cells, red blood cells, bacteria, parasites, crystals, many more things. Each was almost a word or a phrase in this new language in which urine speaks to a physician and telling them what is wrong with the patient. And each taught me a little bit more about this language. Now, to be clear, urine is not fascinating only because it helps a doctor by telling them what's happening inside the patient. Every bodily fluid does that, as I said, right? Stool brings information from the whole gastrointestinal tract. Sputum from the lungs tells you about what's going on deep in the airways where you can't see. And even cerebrospinal fluid, or CSF, it tells you about what's happening inside a patient's brain and spinal cord, their central nervous system. Sometimes there's no other way to know except to get a sample of that fluid and analyze it in the lab. But urine has this really amazing ability to tell me about almost every body part. Urine doesn't only just tell me about what's going on with its own system, its own exit route through the urinary tract. Urine has this almost magical ability to tell me about what's going on with systemic problems to the body as a whole, or with body parts that are far away from the kidneys and seem to have nothing to do with it at all. So I'm going to read from the book again. I learned that red urine can imply problems like kidney stones or bladder cancer, but it can also indicate a genetic defect in red blood cells, a breakdown of the body's muscles, or a recent meal of beets. Urine can uncover a cause of infection in the faraway lungs, announce a recent ingestion of recreational drugs, or, in diabetes, confess the failings of a distant pancreas. In previous centuries, physicians made this last diagnosis by tasting urine for sweetness, a time when taste buds were the only assay. Today, thankfully, this is no longer necessary, though decoding all of urine's secrets still often feels like being a sommelier. So I found urine lovable for this reason alone. This was already a reason to love urine and be fascinated by it, its utility in diagnosing patient diseases. But there was another reason that I loved urine that I go into in the chapter. And this reason goes back to where humanity comes from. Now, let me explain. In making urine from blood, the kidneys keep everything in the blood in just the right balance. So every moment of our lives, before birth and up until death, these internal workhorses titrate electrolytes, which are basically salts in the bloodstream. So if any of them are out of whack, if sodium, potassium, chloride, phosphorus, whatever, if it's too high, kidneys will take more of it out of the bloodstream and put it in the urine and send it out of the body to bring the level back down to normal. If, on the other hand, one of these levels of electrolytes is too low, the kidneys can dial down their extraction of that specific element so that the blood level can rise back to a normal range. So kidneys titrate hundreds and thousands of different little elements in the bloodstream. They also titrate fluid as well. If we did not urinate out fluid, we would basically swell up like water balloons. And I've seen it happen. It's not pretty. Water floods the lungs. People suffocate. So it's really good that urine gets rid of fluids. And the same is true when the body has inadequate fluid, right? Inadequate fluid, what we call dehydration. And this happens really commonly when I see sick people in the ER. They're often quite dehydrated. I'm going to read from the urine chapter again. When the body becomes dehydrated through poor intake or fluids lost to vomiting and diarrhea, the normally surging turgid bloodstream becomes sluggish, like a dried up stream in a drought, and the delivery of nutrients to vital organs diminishes. The kidneys perceive this slackening in the blood vessels and respond by slowing or turning off the urine faucet, preserving the body's hydration while letting out only minuscule amounts of dark yellow and sometimes malodorous urine. Now, this is something I see often, as I said, in sick patients in the ER, and seeing, time after time, I'm often asking patients how much they urinated as a marker of how dehydrated they are. And often that level of dehydration tells me something about how sick they are. So just the amount of urine is an important message for a physician like me, communicated by a sick patient's body. And the less urine, the more concerned they get that they are more severely ill. So thinking more deeply about how the kidneys do this in illness, I wrote the following. By finely calibrating the urine extracted from the bloodstream at every moment of our lives, kidneys safeguard not only the body's hydration, but also its salts. Though mostly water, urine carries salts as well, thereby maintaining the body's essential balance of water and electrolytes. In illness, the kidneys work overtime to accomplish this task, struggling in the face of dehydration to keep blood high in sodium and chloride and low in potassium, roughly the same salt proportions as the world's oceans. Humanity's ancestors first evolved in the sea and subsequently crawled out to take up residence on dry land, but each human body still carries the ocean inside of it. By editing urine out of the bloodstream, kidneys preserve the primordial sea in our blood, maintaining the balance of salt essential to our survival. Without them, and without urine's salubrious flow, our forebears could never have left the ocean, just as each newborn baby could never adjust to life outside its personal salty amniotic sea, itself composed almost wholly from the unborn baby's urine. So when urine flow slows in illness, when patients report poor urine output or parents tell of fewer wet diapers and sick infants, it is the body fighting to maintain the life-giving ocean inside of each of us, our ancestral brine. Now, this is a really good example of something I love about the body. There's so many levels at which you can understand the body, and to really understand it, you have to know it at all these levels. There's the entire body, the entire person, which has a story of their own. You can know the body on that level, of course, as we know all the people in our lives. You can know the human body on the level of individual organs. You can zoom in even further. You can go to the level of what we call histology, which is the level of cells and the tissues that cells make up. Or you can even go further down to the microscopic level. You can look at molecules and biochemical reactions, and understanding the body on all of these levels is essential to really have intimate knowledge of it. But sometimes, like in this case, you can zoom into one specific body part, like the kidney, or even on the microscopic level, how the kidney is titrating all of these elements in the bloodstream. And by zooming in, you're almost simultaneously zooming all the way out and taking in eons of time and millions of years of evolution, and you're bringing up the big questions of where we came from. And that's something I love about learning about the body. So in the urine chapter, I go on to explain why the kidney's job of balancing the salts in our bloodstream is so crucial for every other part of the body. And the kidneys are almost like a keystone species in ecology, the study of how organisms interact in the natural world. We talk about keystone species that kind of hold up the entire framework of an ecosystem. And kidneys are almost like that in the body, something I go into quite a bit of depth on. Here I explain why. Despite their overarching importance to the body's biochemical balances, kidneys churn away in obscurity our entire lives. They're relegated to the back of the abdomen, behind more charismatic organs. Kidneys are the Rodney Dangerfield of our innards. They never get the respect they deserve. Yet the careful harmony protected by the kidney's lifelong labor of making urine ensures that other bodily systems also continue to function. This includes the electrical activity responsible for every heartbeat, every muscle movement, and every neuron firing in the brain, each a manifestation of the ebb and flow of salt ions through water. It is precisely, therefore, because the kidneys receive blood and turn it into urine, that the brain can receive blood and turn it into thought. That's all for urine. My favorite bodily fluid, maybe yours too, after you read that chapter. Also a good segue into the next chapter we're going to do, which is the brain. You wouldn't think the kidneys and brain are all that connected, but of course, everything inside us is connected. So the brain chapter is a good example of another theme of my book, The Unseen Body. And that theme is travel. I first became really fascinated with travel after college, when over a 2-year period, I spent about 1.5 years living in Russia over the course of 4 different trips. And this was before I started medical school, before I ever even thought of or wanted to be a doctor of any kind. Now, side note about travel, we'll come back to the brain, promise. One thing I really love about travel, and anyone who has traveled can tell you, it really opens your eyes to other ways of seeing the world. And once I started studying the human body as a medical student and continued to travel, I found that it also opened up my eyes to new ways of seeing the human body. For example, when I traveled to India during a year off from medical school, I saw a very different way of decorating the human body than I was used to. So people in all cultures decorate the body, adorn it with various ways of doing it. Each culture is a little bit different. Each culture does it in unique ways, but we all use our body to decorate for various purposes. Now, I was used to, for instance, in my family, women paint their fingernails, their eyelids, their lips. But in India, I did not see much of that at all. Instead, I found that a huge part of adorning the body involved using the forehead in various ways, really, and quite creatively, I thought. Many women in India wear a dot in the middle of their forehead called a bindi, just for simple beautification. There's other things you can do with your forehead. Married women in India show their marital status by putting a streak of red powder beginning at the top of their forehead and then extending back into the part in their hair. That's called a sindoor, and that's showing that you're married. You know, instead of wearing a ring on your 4th finger, as we do in the US, some people choose to. That's another way of announcing your marital status. And in temples, Hindu temples throughout India, I saw holy men and women with their foreheads smeared with all kinds of red, yellow, and orange smears and dots of every kind. And this was a show of piety. So the forehead just is taken to this whole nother level in India. And I found that really fascinating. And even my own, after I swam in the Ganges River, not something I would recommend as a physician, but as a traveler, it was pretty great. My own forehead got smeared by this guy standing on the bank of the river with some horizontal yellow lines and a big red dot overlying them. So I got to experience that. And, you know, in the West, the forehead is completely ignored for decorating the body for any purpose at all. But in India, this broad, empty expanse of skin above our eyes basically becomes like a blank canvas used for beautification, for announcing your marital status, for prayer, and it makes complete sense. And another difference I'll mention quickly, another difference I found in India was their very different perspective on the right and left hand. Now in India, my right hand became an eating utensil. And though it took me a while to get used to it, I really grew to love that way of eating. It almost adds another dimension to a meal, almost like adding an additional taste you didn't know existed. The left hand, on the other hand, literally on the other hand, is totally taboo. And I won't get into the dirty details of why, though in the feces chapter of my book, I go into quite some depth. But basically, you use it in the bathroom, your left hand, and you never, ever shake hands with the left hand or eat with the left hand. So I found it fascinating that while the human body is typically anatomically symmetric with the 2 hands mirroring each other, in India, there's overlain on top of it this intense cultural asymmetry where the hands have markedly different status and connotations in Indian society. So back to the brain. Now, the brain chapter, I talk about another way that travel gave me perspective on the body, not quite the same as those examples I just illustrated. But in the brain chapter, I talk about traveling to high altitude in the Himalayan mountains of Nepal. That taught me something about the brain. In 2016, I spent several months working in a high altitude clinic in Nepal. And most of that time I spent at around 11,500 feet above sea level, which is about twice as high as Denver, in a town called Manang. And I treated trekkers there and guides and porters for a variety of illnesses, including some altitude sickness. And it was really the first time that I became familiar with myself with the really incredible stresses that altitude puts on the human body and its physiology. At altitude, of course, the air is thinner. There's less oxygen to breathe. Every breath has less oxygen in it. And this was really noticeable in Manang. I easily lost my breath climbing one flight of stairs to my bedroom, which was on the second floor of the clinic. I even got out of breath toweling off after a shower, like minimal exertion, and I was out of breath. It was very noticeable. And I found that interesting because at sea level, I often, as a physician in the ER, especially, I'm often evaluating people who are short of breath, who are having difficulty breathing. One of the signs I look for to know how severe their shortness of breath is to see if they pause in the middle of sentences to take a breath. And when I see that, it's a red flag. I know that their shortness of breath is more severe, that whatever treatments I'm going to initiate are urgent. But in Manang at high altitude, that was normal. I was taking a breath. I don't think I finished an entire sentence there while the several months I was there without taking a breath in the middle of it. So that's a good illustration of how things at sea level that are normal, or things at sea level that are pathological, actually become very normal at higher altitude. But beyond low oxygen in the air at altitude, there's also lower air pressure. And that combination, the low oxygen and the lower air pressure, really wreaks havoc on the human body. And the body can adapt. You can acclimatize if you ascend slowly enough. But if you ascend too fast and outstrip the body's ability to compensate, to acclimatize, then you can get into some serious trouble. For instance, if you were able to take an elevator from sea level up to the summit of Mount Everest, which is at just about 29,000 feet above sea level, almost everybody on that elevator would die, probably before you even reach the top of the mountain. And specifically, they would die from their brains becoming swollen. Now, on the topic of brain swelling, I write, when it comes to the brain in particular, a little bit of swelling can cause a lot of trouble, unlike with other organs. The lungs, for instance, are designed to constantly expand and contract. Their bony protection, a rib cage made of parallel bones with muscle in between, accommodates this movement by expanding and contracting in concert. The brain's bony protection, the skull, is much more rigid and immovable, especially after the first few months of life, when the mobile plates of a newborn baby's skull fuse into a solid, unstretchable encasement with very little room to spare. Now, altitude can affect other organs. Some people on that elevator to Mount Everest would experience their lungs filling with fluid, not too dissimilar from if your kidneys failed and your body puffed up like a water balloon. But the brain really bears the brunt of altitude's effects. As I write in the brain chapter, more so than any other organ, altitude most severely affects the brain, which seemed fitting. The brain lives at the highest altitude of any internal organ, at least when we stand upright. But the brain is also our loftiest body part in other ways. It is the executive organ, the one that oversees all our other parts from its vaunted perch inside the cranium. The brain sits at the body's helm, pulling levers and steering wheels, a commanding captain with the human body as its ship. Even neurons, the branching electrical cells that make up the brain, seem more complex and majestic than any other type of cell found in the body. If organs were organized into a caste system similar to the strict social hierarchy found in India and also in Nepal, the brain would be its Brahman. Well-being at altitude and altitude sickness is really a very peculiar niche of human health, and I learned virtually nothing about it in medical school. But there isn't actually a whole lot to learn. Why exactly altitude affects the brain in this way, why it causes the brain to swell is largely unknown. And working in Nepal showed me the wide variety of unexplained symptoms that people experience in high altitude. And most of them, even though the most severe, resolve when you descend, when you lower your altitude. So simply hiking down from the mountains is one of modern medicine's few perfect cures, for altitude sickness at least. And in this way, human health at altitude, it remains a really mysterious frontier of medical understanding. And I found that also fitting, because the brain is also a frontier of medical understanding, perhaps our most mysterious and poorly understood internal organ. As I write in the book, the functions of the brain are still barely understood by the most advanced neuroscience research. It remains a black box, even though we live inside of it. So still, while I was in Nepal, I treated people for altitude sickness, most of it mild, some of it severe. I got altitude sickness myself, which was interesting. It's always a good experience for a doctor to get a disease themselves, gives you some perspective, shows you what the patients go through. And I describe a bunch of those cases in the chapter, but I also describe how going higher and higher into the mountains taught me about the brain. first there was the week of walking that it took to get to Menang. And then also when I hiked some weeks later, another 2 days past Menang to get to a mountain pass called Thorong La, which is at about 18,000 feet above sea level. And going higher and higher into the mountains and discovering more and more austere and barren landscapes and more frigid temperatures really reminded me of ascending higher and higher within the central nervous system. So the brain, as I said, is our highest altitude internal organ, but even within the brain, there are various levels that increase in complexity as we climb up and up. There's 1,000,001 ways to break down the brain into parts to better understand it. There's the old scheme of lizard brain, mammalian brain, which has mostly been abandoned. There's a bunch of newer ones, but I kind of like breaking it down by altitude. So you start at the lowest level, starting your hike at the lowest altitude, the brain stem, which is at about the height of your nostrils, but in the back of your neck. The brain stem really handles very basic functions of the body itself. It keeps your heart beating, your lungs breathing, maintaining your blood pressure. It's really these robotic functions that it focuses on, and there's really no hint of what we would call the mind at that level. Climbing up higher, ascending in altitude from the brainstem, you get to the emotion centers, where you find things like fear, apprehension, anxiety. And these are in some ways the first inkling of subjectivity, the first time that we see anything that we might call awareness or consciousness or the mind. And you can travel further still, all the way up to the extremes of internal altitude, the brain summit, the cerebral cortex, which is a thin veneer on the brain's convoluted surface. Now, this is where the primary processing happens. This is where the brain's most coveted functions happen: cognition, problem solving, etc. And I reflect on these loftiest heights of the brain while climbing to Thorong La, the highest altitude I've ever been at least with my feet on the ground. Airplanes don't count. But throughout my trip, as I climbed higher and higher, I was in a way searching for where the brain ends and the mind begins. If there is such a place, that question's probably not answerable, but I explore it and I talk to some people to give me perspective, including a Tibetan Buddhist Lama, a 78-year-old woman who goes by the name Ani. She's lived in a cave just outside Menang all by herself for the last 38 years, spends most of her day meditating, at least when annoying tourists are not coming by to see what's going on, such as myself one day. But this pointed out to me another way in which brains and mountains are connected, because we often retreat to the mountains to clear our heads, figuratively, to get a new perspective on life, to meditate as Ani does, to rise above the daily fray, literally by rising above it, by hiking upward into the mountains, is how we kind of retreat into our own heads. So Ani told me via a translator that she spends most of each day meditating. That was the main reason she lived so high in the Himalayas. The solitude and silence of her abode were essential for concentrating on her spiritual practice. Even a tiny village like Menang was too noisy for her, with its constant din of cows, yaks, children, and clanging bells. Situated high up on the valley wall, her cave was remote, even by Menang standards, and offered a refuge from the bustle of society on whatever scale. The higher one goes in the mountains, the inherently fewer distractions, humanity being increasingly rarefied like oxygen molecules in the air. I also imagine that slowing down and achieving the focused mindfulness of meditation was helped along by the extravagant respiratory cost of any exertion at this altitude. For a different perspective, I also spoke with a clinical psychiatrist, Dr. Yudkov, who actually doesn't believe the mind exists at all. Now, to me, that was very interesting, and it sort of sounded like an internist who doesn't believe in internal organs. But he explained actually that the mind is an amalgam. The mind is actually a layered infusion combining the most basic reflexes from the deeper brain levels, from the brainstem, overlaid and intermixed and interconnected with the loftier functions of emotion and cognition. And in a way, whenever we have a thought or whenever we think to do something and then do it, we're using all levels of the brain all at once, all intermixed, all altitudes all at once, operating in concert. Yudkov said, "The mind is a necessary concept for psychiatrists, but it is a quaint and outdated idea. We've known for over a century that the brain divides its labor into various parts, and therefore consciousness is similarly pieced together like a quilt, no matter how fluid it feels. Mind is simply the word we use to describe what it feels like to have a human brain, our internal organ of cognition. Yudkov told me that one day in the distant future, when we know significantly more about the brain and mind, neurology and psychiatry will have more in common as medical specialties. In that omniscient future, we may no longer have to wonder how it is that our brains exude awareness, just as any other gland in the body secretes its biochemical product. That's all for the brain, much more in that chapter. Now we're going to move on to our third and final body part of the night. And this is the throat. Now I'm going to, again, do some readings from this chapter. And in this chapter, I wonder if the throat might be the most poorly designed body part of all. Is it? Maybe. So I'll start with the reading. When I first studied human anatomy in medical school, one body part in particular seemed rather stupidly designed: the throat. Our throats are where swallowed food and inhaled air, after entering the body through the same mouth, diverge into their respective tubes, the esophagus and the windpipe. In the throat, the esophagus' entrance for swallowed food lies immediately behind the windpipes for inhaled air, like two straws with their open ends abutting each other, and only a few scant millimeters of tissue dividing them. Diagrams in my medical textbook showed the details of the throat, or pharynx, an all-important intersection where, with each and every swallow, food and drink careen directly over the windpipe's entrance, coming within a hair's breadth of slipping in. One tiny lapse could cause choking, suffocation, and death. The throat's perilous construction stood in stark contrast to the brilliant design of other body parts I'd been learning about. The human hand and forearm, for instance, possess a wondrously dexterous architecture of bones, muscles, and tendons, with the staggering ability to grasp tools or play jazz piano. And with equal elegance, the perfectly synchronized cooperation of heart and lungs delivers oxygen to all of the body's distant crevices. Anatomical mechanisms always seemed intelligent, to favor life and enhance survival, but not the throat. So the throat's most basic, most fundamental job throughout our lives is to keep everything but air out of the windpipe. Everything else must go down the esophagus. And as I said, one slip up and you could be dead. This is one of the body's most basic responsibilities, to stay alive. To go from today till tomorrow, your body must keep things out of your windpipe, period. But the throat seems so prone to failure because of this design. But also part of the problem is swallowing, which is an incredibly complex mechanism, too complex and too prone to fail. Though it is casual, I'm going to read again. Though it is casually performed hundreds of times each day by all our throats, swallowing is no simple feat. Maneuvering food and drink safely past the airway's entrance requires an intricate neuromuscular orchestra of contractions and contortions of the tongue, palate, pharynx, and jaw. Food approaches the windpipe as we swallow, and just as suffocation seems imminent, several different muscles coordinate to lift up the windpipe's top end, the larynx. This timely gesture is visible from the outside as the Adam's apple jerking upward, as it tucks the airway's exposed opening under the tongue, sealing it closed against the epiglottis, a firm flap of tissue that perfectly plugs the larynx like a manhole cover. Food and drink can then safely sidestep the airway, traveling beyond it and into the esophagus. And once the coast is clear, the larynx lowers again and settles halfway down the neck. Swallowing involves the cooperation of 5 separate cranial nerves and more than 20 different muscles. This complicated mechanism is the body's attempt to compensate for the throat's inherently dangerous anatomy, but it is a clunky and overly complex solution to a serious problem, and therefore prone to failure. This is especially the case when people talk while eating, an attempt to keep both the esophagus and the airway open at once. It is no wonder that so many people choke to death every year. Now, working in a hospital, I found that a significant proportion of my job consists of battling the fallout of the throat's flawed design, namely things going down the wrong pipe. And I don't only mean choking. The unfortunate truth is that most people who choke don't make it to the hospital. They're either saved in the field or they're not, and they don't make it. But choking is one kind of what we call aspiration, when things go down the wrong tube. So choking is where one big solid food chunk goes down the wrong tube and blocks all air movement. But the people I treat in the ER, and when I worked as a hospitalist treating hospitalized patients exclusively, These people were aspirating much smaller amounts of food, drink, and saliva. You can even aspirate vomit that comes up the esophagus and goes down the trachea, or refluxed stomach acid that takes the same route. But for elderly and debilitated patients, this is a huge problem, aspiration, because people suffering from neurodegenerative diseases like dementia, people becoming weaker after strokes and other neurologic diseases, their swallowing mechanisms, these very complex mechanisms that we rely on every day thoughtlessly, they become distorted. It doesn't work as well. The coordination is lacking. The muscles themselves become weaker, and even the gag reflex, which is kind of the throat's blocking of anything besides air that's headed for the windpipe, it becomes weak, and it's less able to turn back those intruders, really. And so aspirated material going down into the lungs is a huge problem. And specifically, one of the problems is that it often brings bacteria with it down into the lungs, which can cause pneumonia. As I write, to top off all of the throat's dangers, the number one pneumonia-causing strain of bacteria in the world lives in the back of the human throat, just above the airways opening. Poised there much of our lives and forever ready to slip into the lungs, these bacteria wait for the moment the airways guard is let down. So the throat's design really has some shortcomings, not going to lie. And often in these elderly, debilitated people where the guard is let down, they suffer from the resulting pneumonia, which we call aspiration pneumonia. And this is a very common, in some instances, the most common way that people with advanced dementia die. And it got me thinking. I in the chapter, I talk about one patient in particular, Suzanne, who had very advanced dementia. She no longer spoke and hardly even interacted in any way. She came in with her second aspiration pneumonia in a month, and caring for her led to this chapter. And caring for such patients as Suzanne who have advanced dementia is really one of the most medically difficult and emotionally difficult aspects of practicing medicine. And end-of-life issues become a very big part of caring for these patients. So beginning, I'm going to read from the book, and then this will be the last part of the talk. Beginning with the first breath after birth, air and food are precisely partitioned in our throats, a lifelong pharyngeal juggling act. Keeping food out of the airway is among our body's most basic responsibilities, but when the throat of a person debilitated by strokes or Alzheimer's can no longer sustain the coordination of juggling, aspiration is how the body gives out. It is among the most common causes of death in such patients. As a medical student, I mocked the throat's design. And as a young hospitalist, I viewed it as a significant threat to my patients. But after years of working as a physician, I came to also see it as the body's way out of life. Aspiration pneumonia was once called old man's friend because it often brings a dignified end to prolonged suffering in the elderly and ill. Like a cyanide pill kept in a locket, the throat's precarious anatomy becomes the degraded body's escape hatch. And sometimes, no matter how much we want the people we love to hold on for a little longer, such as when my wife's grandfather with Parkinson's disease was repeatedly admitted to the hospital with one pneumonia after another, the end cannot be forestalled any further. Sometimes the body decides for us. Through caring for patients like Suzanne, I realized that there is wisdom in the throat's design after all. Thank you very much.
Hey there, thank you so much. We have a couple of questions if you would like to answer a few of them.
I'd love to.
Let's just see, I'm trying to, they're all very exciting. This question from Morgan is, what do you think about the link between the gut microbiome and mental health? Caught my eye.
It's a great question and a very interesting and intense area of research currently. You know, just when we think we know a lot about the body's story and what's going on inside of it, we kind of, a whole new realm of understanding can be opened. And that's what happened with the microbiome in recent years and decades. And there's great promise. You know, studies currently are mostly prove that therapies that affect the gut microbiome can treat various intestinal infections like C. difficile. But there seems to be a very strong association with many diseases completely unrelated to the intestines too, such as mental illness. Now, I'm not up on that literature, and I think that literature is just in its really beginning stages, but I'm very excited about it. And I do think the microbiome is a reason to for doctors to go into the field of infectious disease, because it is so exciting and holds so much promise. And I talked about choosing your specialty based on bodily fluids, but choosing it also based on areas of research that are bound to explode in the coming years and decades is another great reason. So the answer is, I wish I knew more, but it's very promising.
Awesome. Another question that I want to tack a little something onto that is kind of along the lines of my biggest question. This is an anonymous attendee who said, what has been your favorite place to travel, and where do you feel you learned the most eye-opening thing about medicine? And then my kind of caveat to that is, what are your thoughts for all of us who are non-MDs about exploration of our own bodies over time? How can we be explorers of our own body? And then also explorers of the world, as you have done and continue to do.
Well, I would say the most medically enlightening travel I ever did was probably as a medical student to Mumbai, India, where I observed in a public hospital for about 2 months. And I was basically, the public hospital treats the poorest aspects of the population, the poorest people. And when I went there, it literally felt like my medical textbook had come to life, because I saw all these diseases that I had only read about and really never expected to see in my entire medical career. Not only because, India is in a more tropical latitude and we're in a temperate latitude, but also just because a lot of the diseases have been eradicated here as well through vaccination and through, even rheumatic heart disease through the early treatment of strep throat. But going to Mumbai and seeing all those patients with their diseases that most American doctors never see in a whole career was really fascinating. But also the socioeconomic implications of that were really, really impressed me a lot too, because that in those poor people who go to that hospital, they don't go to the hospital until they're so sick that they literally cannot get up and go to work. And they come to that hospital from rural regions of Maharashtra outside of Mumbai. So when they show up, their disease is very advanced and often too late to even treat it, if they can even afford the treatments, which you have to pay up front for in India. They don't have a complex medical health insurance system like we do here. So seeing those diseases and seeing the state of how people living in poverty in India have to deal with those diseases was really eye-opening for me. In terms of exploring your body and the world, I love travel, and I think any way you can get out, even going from one part of the U.S. to another is a very legitimate way to travel and can be very eye-opening for a lot of people. Maybe more people should do that these days. In fact, explore your own country and meet people who live lives very different from your own. We all get a little bit ensconced in our own bubbles, culturally, politically, economically, et cetera, and getting out in any way. You don't have to go see the poorest of the poor in India to really have your eyes open. In terms of exploring your own body, hey, have fun. As a doctor, probably should tell you to also be careful though.
Cool. Yeah, that's all real. And kind of leads into the last question that I think would be a good way to round this out. Becca and Ben Yudkov ask if all fluids gross you out.
What do you do?
Yeah, that's just the question. If all fluids gross you out, question mark?
Well, that Yudkov is the psychiatrist that I referenced in the brain chapter, and the psychiatrist who I knew in medical school who was grossed out by all bodily fluids and went into psychiatry. He could never stand the sight of blood. And we wondered our friends wondered how he would ever be a doctor since blood made him faint. But he found the way, being a psychiatrist. And I'm glad he did, because he helped expand my own perception of the brain as well. Thank you, Dr. Yudkov.
Yeah, well, and thank you. Thank you for this hour. And thank you to everyone who is here listening. Thank you for all the questions. I think we're close to the top of the hour, so I wanted to thank everybody for being here. It's been an honor, Jonathan. Thank you so much.
My pleasure.
And thank you, everybody here, for joining us on At Home with Literati tonight. Make sure to buy The Unseen Body. The link is in the chat. And so take care, everybody. Thank you, and have a good night.
Thank you.
Okay.